Chronopunk, a novel, episode 11. This episode is the actual philosophical and scientific gist of the novel. This episode summarizes the author's views on the science and the philosophy of humanity in general. So this is not necessarily a scientific treatise on time travel. I've said this before. I am shying away from that. There is a scientific concept of time travel, which is related to teleportation. That's not what this episode is about. This episode is more, it's inspired by the book that I'm reading right now, which is Wolves of Eternity by Knausgaard. And there's a section there where one of the protagonists calls her stepfather, and they talk about reality and the world and philosophy and politics and things along those lines. So this is a similar section of the novel. It's Deborah and Moody are sitting at the hotel bar. We're in between court dates. So if you recall, episode 10 starts the court procedure, the whole purpose of the novel, the whole gist of the storyline is that Moody is sent back from the future to sue Ben Bernanke and prevent quantitative easing in 2009. So this is the context. This episode is interjected. So this is modular in the sense that it can be added or it can be not added to the novel. I decided to add it in this sequence here. Whether it's going to end up in the finished published novel, we'll see. And I think this is, like I said in the synopsis in the beginning of this series, we're doing an open crowdsourcing here, so I'm happy for feedback. So this section is a philosophical treatise by the author on his thoughts, and it really, it's a long episode. It's much longer than the others, and it's just a dialogue. So this is more like if you think of Chronopunk as a Netflix series, this would be more like a theater play than there's not a lot of action here. It's just really just talk. And I want to focus on three fundamental things here. Okay, number one is the concept of the update rule and the concept of having an initial set of conditions and then a certain update rule or a certain way to transform those conditions. And that's how any kind of system grows and turns into a complex system. So that's number one. Number two is the idea of what actually quantum computers really mean, what they bring to the table, which is they show us what we believe is true, which is that all events that could happen actually happen, and quantum computers just visualize that. And the third thing, and that is fairly new actually, this is a almost real-time knowledge creation and manifestation. I've just attended a lecture by a professor at Stanford who is working on quantum dark matter detection, and that's where the idea comes from. And the connection here is that quantum dark matter detection actually could be a path towards solving the dark matter problem. And now this is fiction. In this novel, Moody explains to Deborah that actually happened. The dark matter riddle was solved, and it was solved by understanding that dark matter interacts with a quantum computer, and that dark matter are actually traces of multiverses that can be detected with quantum computers, because the quantum computers they entangle many states, and some of these states do interact with the entanglement of dark matter from other multiverses. And that is kind of like that we found that the quantum computer is just a flashlight with an infinite amount of beams, and then you tune those beams towards a certain needle, and then you can actually find the needle in the haystack. In other words, you can interact with another multiverse. So basically, the solution to dark matter is that dark matter is they are traces of multiverses in our universe. So that's fiction. Again, this is not scientific at all. It's just inspired by a lecture. But I think what's really interesting, and that's the initial image of the episode, shows Kurt Gödel and Hugh Everett walking on a beach. And the idea is that dark matter reconciles Kurt Gödel with Hugh Everett. And maybe I want to start with that, because this is really sort of the, it's the, if you will, it's a new theory, it's a new idea. It's not a theory, it's an idea. And the idea is the following. Like, you have Hugh Everett, many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, which says that we just follow the math. The Schrödinger equation tells us that anything that can happen actually happens. Now, that requires a little bit of imagination, but it is actually consistent with the idea that nothing that happens can happen without some sort of outside relation, or, if you will, an observer. So the actual concept of something happening requires an outside observer, and that's why the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is not just following the Schrödinger equation and following the math, but it's also conceptually important. Nothing can happen if there is no a spin up of an electron only makes sense if there is also an alternative, a spin down. Otherwise, the spin up on its own doesn't really make any sense. So this is Hugh Everett. Kurt Gödel comes from a whole different angle. He formulates his incompleteness theorem, which says things can be true but not provable. Now, analyzing that, I was always struggling. What does it mean? What's the difference between true and provable? And in writing this episode, I actually conclude that truth is simply the optimization of infinite trajectories under the constraint of energy consumption. So what is true is just the thing that, I use the scrambling of an egg, the scrambling and the unscrambling. So everything in principle is symmetrical. Every egg can be every egg can be scrambled in multiple ways and unscrambled in multiple ways. And the true way to scramble and unscramble, or the truth, what actually an egg, or what scrambling an egg actually means, is simply the one trajectory that consumes the least amount of energy. That's what is true. So this is a physical manifestation. Truth is physics. It doesn't require us to define something. We don't need God. We don't need a consensus. We don't need Congress to decide what is true. It is simply an optimization over multiple trajectories with the least amount of energy. That's what truth is. The provability of it comes from the outside. In other words, we can prove that that's true because we can see other trajectories and then decide this one is the best. So we need the others to define that's true. So here I'm connecting Kurt Gödel with Hugh Everett. And I think this is it's a conceptual framework. Of course, it's not proven because we don't have quantum computers that actually simulate all these trajectories. But in principle, I am connecting Kurt Gödel with Hugh Everett, and I'm happy with this. I'm proud of this. This is a nice idea. So this is the gist of this episode. I would say that's why I chose it as an image. Kurt Gödel and Hugh Everett connect. There's a lot of other ideas in this episode. For example, like I just said, the concept of truth. Deborah asks Moody, how did your morals change? You see, once you go down that route, and this is the famous it from bit and bit from it conversation. Wheeler, David Deutsch, all of these philosophers, in my opinion, have a lot more weight than just as physicists, because once you define physics in terms of a many worlds theory, and in terms of truth being something that proliferates throughout the multiverse under the constraint of least amount of energy. Once you have that, you also start changing your morals. For example, like I said, Deborah asks Moody, how did your morals change? So now this is a conversation between a lady that lives in 2008 and a man that comes from 2060. So they have a conversation about their societies, which are about 50 years apart. I thought that in itself, of course, is an interesting concept, but that's not the main point. The main point is what they say. So Moody says, yes, our morals have changed dramatically because we have visualization. Quantum computers help us see what trajectories are possible. And because of that, we change our morals. We understand that lying and things like that are bad because they consume more energy. Now, I'm not elaborating why that's the case, but the point is, and this is something that we intuitively know. For example, why do 5-year-olds, why do we tell our kids not to lie? Because it compounds badly. Bad deeds don't age well. This is Jordan Peterson also talks about this. Some of the morals that, for example, Christianity is propagating, and most other religions, by the way, that's the interesting thing. Like, adultery, stealing, lying, killing, a lot of these things proliferate throughout societies across the globe. Amazon jungle tribes, different religions, different tribes. This is not just something that is written in the Bible or the Quran. This is across the world. That's why it's universal. And why is it universal? Because, and now this, we're connecting this to science. Well, if we follow a many worlds theory of quantum physics, and we simply say that trajectories are defined as the one, or everything can happen, everything that can happen will happen, but we're going to choose the trajectories, or a trajectory is defined as a sequence of events that requires less energy. And now we add to that the moral philosophy, which is simply, why is it that lying requires more energy than saying the truth? And you can have your own thoughts about this. My thought is simply that if I keep lying, I'm going to put myself in a position where eventually I'm going to need a lot more effort and energy to get myself out of that hole. That's kind of roughly what this means. Moody explains that this is the fundamental idea, and this brings me back to the first point, the update rule. The whole episode starts with sort of alluding to Stephen Wolfram's The New Kind of Science, which I think has interesting ideas. The idea being that you start with a very simple system and then you proliferate the system with an update rule. And the point here being that Moody says that societies have update rules, and the fundamental change that happened throughout humanity was that the update rules changed. And he starts with, let's say, he says there's been an update rule. For example, one of the main update rules that every human society or every living being actually has is, consume nutrition, proliferate, things like that. Then the humans started changing that update rule towards eat more protein, things like that, which helped them get bigger brains and rule the world. But then the crucial change in the update rule, according to Moody, was that somewhere around the Renaissance, the update rule was changed towards caring for the children. So we didn't just produce more children, so we have more warriors or something like that. We actually started caring for the human. And then later on, and this is according to Moody, the big breakthrough in the American Revolution was we wanted to have a better world for our children than the world we have, which is an interesting idea in its own. And Moody talks about it. For example, the update rule in China is very similar, but has one subtle difference. In China, people optimize, so they want their kids to take care of themselves when they're older. Or for example, in other places like Europe, the update rule is much more maybe something like you wanna just have a fair society or something like that. Americans want their kids to have a better life than they had before. And that's the main driver of innovation and progress, and that's why America is so successful. So what Moody is saying is that this update rule changed at some point in the mid-20th century and then culminated during the pandemic, in COVID in the 2020s, when everything was turned into instant gratification. And he's saying, I was sent back by my society from 2060 back to 2009 because the main reason that happened is free money and quantitative easing, and instant gratification is a bad update rule. It requires a lot more energy and is therefore not optimal. And because we had quantum computers, we could see those trajectories and therefore choose the one that is better. So this is kind of the connection between science, philosophy, and the reason why Moody's there. This is why I chose to put in this chapter, even though I didn't want this book to be a philosophical treatise or a scientific treatise. I thought to myself, it's an interesting connection between the science of quantum, between the morals, and between the actual economic impact of what Moody is trying to achieve. I think finally what I want to say, which is another interesting emergent idea from this episode, is the connection between science and spirituality. And the idea that if quantum physics is the idea or is the theory of anything that is possible, then eventually, if you have a quantum computer with hundreds and hundreds of qubits, and you think about you can represent 2 to the power of n states, n being the qubits. If you have 200 qubits, 2 to the power of 200 is it's a number that we can't even fathom. So we can express an infinite amount of, basically close to infinite amount of states, and therefore, and then optimize, like I just said, find trajectories, which is simply find the symmetries in those states that require the least amount of energy. In other words, what's the most efficient way to scramble and unscramble an egg, and that's the trajectory we want to choose. And now, if we have a society like that, then nature, reality, is a fact, right? What I'm saying is that in a world like that, in a world where we can simulate with a powerful quantum computer everything that is actually possible, then there is no such thing as randomness, because we can see everything. And Deborah says, oh, how bad, this is horrible, because I don't want the world to be a fact. And then Moody says, that's not such a problem, don't worry. If we can see all the trajectories, we can still have a choice but which one to choose. So we can still have all the debates and all the philosophical debates and the moral debates and all those things. What we don't have to deal with now is uncertainty. And we are sort of, we don't have to deal with with superstition and empty hype. But what we actually can do is now make a much more qualified choice. So having access to quantum computer, having access to this type of knowledge is giving us, is just helps us make better decisions. So this is just and the conclusion is that with quantum technology advanced, spirituality changes, because now we have basically found a better way to express the language of nature. And then Moody says that, in fact, for our society, spirituality and science are 2 sides of the same coin. What they do is they both try to understand the language of nature. The spirituality comes from the whole and deducts ideas from the whole, and science comes from the bottom, from the particle, and works itself up, and they come up to the same thing, which is, okay, these are all possibilities, and now we make moral choices, and the more informed we are, the better we understand nature, the better choices we can make. So to summarize, this episode, again, is really crucial. It covers 3 things. It covers the update rule. It covers the concept of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, that everything that happens is actually happening, so everything that can happen is happening, and what that means for spirituality, and what that means for moral philosophy, and then finally the idea of the reconciliation of Gödel and Everett through the multiverse. And then this is just fictional, the idea that dark matter could be potentially a solution, or the solution to dark matter could be that maybe it is traces of multiverses interacting with our universe, and the way we can find that is by having a quantum computer that can simulate an infinite amount of trajectories and then interact with certain trajectories that do entangle with the with the other multiverses, and that's what dark matter is. Thank you.